Natasha Romanoff was now talking to the restaurant owner I liked so much, and Mario was now telling her why he likes Super Mario video games so much, and Mario said I love those games because they still hold a lot of innocence, and I played those games and I almost felt like a kid again, and also my father was an Italian plumber and he said they actually got the idea for the Super Mario character from him, which I thought was very interesting, Mario said. And then Natasha Romanoff smiled big and she looked surprised, and then she said now that's interesting, and then Natasha asked him so how long have you been a culinary chef, and then he said I trained with all the best chefs in France and all across Europe when I was very young, and those were the good old days, and I actually met my beautiful wife in France, and Mario smiled warmly while thinking about his wife, and then Mario said speaking of wives, where is your beautiful wife Jessica Jones? You two usually come in here and talk my ear off about playing Mario Kart in the arcades as kids, and I told you both that's not a real Super Mario video game, and then I said yes it is, and I played all the Super Mario games and so did my wife Jessica, and then Mario chuckled and said I'm just messing with you, kid. And after talking with Mario briefly we ordered 2 large Italian pizzas, and I talked to Natasha Romanoff about everything for hours, and I knew she was falling in love with me, and I told her about my life as a private investigator and a full-time superhero, and I'm also a doctor that went to actual medical school just like my sister Jean Grey, and then Natasha Romanoff asked me so are you and your sister twins, and then I said yes, identical, actually we were born on the same day and in the same year, and then Natasha Romanoff said I definitely know the X-Men and I even know about you, and then I said I'm going to get to the point, I know who you are too, Natasha Romanoff, because you see I know everything and it's a perk of having godlike powers, and I even know that Nick Fury sent you to recruit me, but before I say yes I want to go somewhere in private with you so I can hopefully get to know you better, and then Natasha Romanoff said I already talked to you for many hours, I know a lot about you already, and then I said well you don't know everything, and then I smiled big, my beautiful teeth on display, and then Natasha Romanoff smiled like a pervert, and then Natasha said most of the time I wouldn't do this, but you are one of the very few exceptions to my rule, and I believe there's something very special about you, and I'm usually not wrong about thinking there's something special about a person, and then she drove us back to my Avengers Towers, and then she said nice building, and then Black Widow and I went to an empty soundproof apartment and we both had sex for many hours, and Natasha Romanoff is absolutely gorgeous. I enjoyed making love to her so much that I moaned loudly and I had many orgasms, and she and I didn't want to stop having sex, and I don't get tired, but Natasha Romanoff is still very human, but I'm not. She continued having sex with me for about 24 hours until she finally passed out, and I was now spooning and holding her gently around her waist while sleeping, and she was now smiling completely satisfied, and then Natasha Romanoff walked up and stared out the window at New York City while it was dark and she was still nude, and I walked up behind her and I kissed the back and side of her neck, and then she said easy tiger, I'm still very sore, and then I said there's also one other thing you don't know about me. I can get any woman pregnant because my DNA has healing properties since I don't operate within fundamental forces, even my children grow up very fast, so you're definitely pregnant, Natasha Romanoff, and then I smiled warmly at her, and then she said fascinating, so you healed me with your DNA, and then I said yes ma'am I did, and then I asked her when do you think you will be able to make love to me again, and then she said probably soon but not now, I need rest, handsome, and then Natasha Romanoff said I think it's very unique that you have dark red hair, and then I said well I was born with it and I actually look like a young Scott Adkins with dark red hair, and then in the morning Natasha Romanoff definitely made love to me again in every sexual position, and then when I made her breakfast with my powers she was very impressed and she said you're amazing and you're like the perfect boyfriend and husband, and then I said thanks for the compliment, gorgeous, but you haven't seen anything yet, and then Natasha Romanoff said I have an idea of how powerful you are because you have been classified as a god-level mutant like your sister Jean Grey, and then I said I am stronger than my sister, she has a portion of the Phoenix Force and I have all the powers of the Phoenix Force and the Infinity Force inside me, it basically allows me to tap into infinite powers.